And my aim is to tell the story of the Spitfire and not get too technical. We normally, sometimes, we can have highly technical chats about engines and design and so on. I'm going to keep this as the story. So part one, we start with the design and the experience of a Spitfire. So the beautiful and the instantly recognizable Spitfire must surely rank up as some of the most capable aircraft ever built. It was designed as a short-range, high-performance interceptor by Reginald Mitchell at the Supermarine Aviation Works, at the time a subsidiary of Vickers Armstrong, which was a major aircraft manufacturer. It was based on their famous S6, the seaplane that won what was that cup? The Schneider Trophy in the 1930s, and it was designed around the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which was a new design at the time. It had elliptical wings, flush rivets, and the thinnest possible cross-section to give it a top speed higher than any contemporary fighter at the time. So after Mitchell's untimely death in 1937, it was really his protege, Joseph Smith, which I believe is no relation to John. They took the Spitfire through development phases and through all the many variants that there was. So the story starts in 1931, when there was a requirement for a modern fighter capable of 250 miles per hour, and this was won by Gloucester's Gladiator. And the Supermarine entry was called the Model 224, and it turned out to be a huge disappointment. A revised specification in 1934 opened in the door for a cleaned up design, and the Type 300 became the Spitfire as we know it. So on the 1st of December 1934, after seeing these plans, the Air Ministry provided £10,000 for construction of this improved design, and the only requirement they added was that the armament be upped from 2 to 4.303 machine guns per wing. And on the 5th of March 1935, the prototype was flown by Captain Joseph Summers, who famously said when he landed, he said, "Don't touch anything." Now just for reference, that was the Model 224 from 1931, and you can see the basic idea of the Spitfire already forming. The wing design is there, the monocoque design is there, and that was the very first Spitfire K5054 as it was flown in 1935. This picture I found is from the Packard Works in the US, who also built Merlin engines under license, and this was just an introduction, and for you to get an idea of what the inside of this plane looked like. It was basically 4 main beams from the back to the front, and it had about 14 bulkheads, and over those bulkheads it was aluminium stressed and riveted, so the integral strength, it was different to a Hurricane, which was basically wooden construction and fabric or aluminium covering it. This was integral to the strength of the plane. You can see in the wings, the cutout there were the two machine guns, the two 303s there. This was a later model, so you had the cannon there. And 2 fuel tanks, engine in the front, and you can see the bulkheads behind the pilot there. Just a basic idea of what the Spitfire looked like inside. Between May and June of 1935, the aircraft went through a series of developmental flights and in the end got a new shaped propeller, a wooden propeller in those days, and a new engine which took the top speed then up to 348 miles per hour in level flight and at altitude, obviously. The plane was then passed on to the Airplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, and the test pilot, Humphrey Edward Jones, the only thing he could add to this design, he said, we just need something to indicate that the gear is up and locked. And this was added, and then in mid-1936 there was an order placed for 310 Spitfires. So although the Spitfire was then publicly shown at the Hendon Air Show in June of 1936, it was not until mid-1938 that the first planes actually rolled off the assembly line, and the reason for this was this was a brand new way of building an aircraft, and they ran into all kinds of problems doing this. So Supermarine is a small company. They could not deliver those 310 planes in the 15 months that they promised. And although they realized that they had to outsource, they didn't want to see their blueprints going all over the place, and they sort of kept back and didn't want to share. They were slow in releasing the subcomponents and those blueprints. So manufacturing was added at a new facility at Castle Bromwich, which was at the time run by the Marais Motor Group under Lord Neufeld. And because of the delays in production and personnel problems there, because they were now planning to build the Spitfire, but these guys were used to building Marais cars, and they couldn't reach the production what they needed to do. And Lord Beaverbrook, who was in charge of airplane production before the war period, he took over the factory under the Air Ministry umbrella, and he flew in experienced Supermarine personnel. And by June 1940, the first 10 Mark II aircraft left the factory, climbing to 23 in July, eventually 56 by September, and by June 1945, the Castle Bromwich factory had built a total of 12,129 Spitfires. Now, Brendan sitting here, I think Castle Bromwich built his Jaguar. That's what they're building these days. So now with the production spread in between some facilities, the Mark I's were quickly supplemented by the Mark II. Now these were the two Marks that was fighting the Battle of Britain against the Messerschmitt 109E, or called the Emil. And this is considered by many to be the most beautiful of all the Spitfires. The Mark I and II were unfortunately unable to keep up once the first of the Friedrichs, the 109Fs, started appearing by the winter of 1940, and upping the power and the armament became essential. Afterwards, we can look here. I've got the Messerschmitt 109E and the F model on display in Desert War colors. But let's take a closer look at those first Marks. All the Spitfire Mark I's were built in Southampton by Supermarine. They initially had a two-bladed wooden propeller, but from aircraft number 78 it was replaced by the EVELYN two-speed three-bladed propeller, so it only had two stages of pitch control. It flew with first the Merlin 2 and the Merlin 3 engine, developing 990 horsepower and 130 horsepower respectively. The Spitfire Mark IIs were all built at Castle Bromwich with a Rotel or the Havilland constant speed propeller. The Mark II had 1150 horsepower in the Merlin 12 engine. The Mark IIA had 8 machine guns, and the 2B introduced the 20mm cannon. Now the reason why they went for the 303s, for the 8 303s per wing, is after the experiences with the First World War, they expected with a higher speed in the Second World War that a plane will have a fraction of a second to shoot down the enemy. So a cannon, the slow rate of fire of a cannon meant that, you know, you could probably hit with one of those bullets, but 8 machine guns spread over a distance, your chances of hitting that plane is just much higher. Unfortunately, with the development of protection on new planes, it became abundantly clear that the machine gun is not going to do it. So they did end up introducing the 20mm cannon as well. Now the Mark III was supposed to follow, and it was to be a complete redesign of the airframe to take the new Merlin 60 series engines. But they had, because of the introduction of the Messerschmitt F, they had to get an interim design going, and they improved performance. They fitted the Merlin 45 to a Mark II airframe, and this became the Mark V, which in the end became the highest production model of the Spitfire. The Merlin 45 developed 1,440 horsepower, and in the end it was built at Castle Bromwich predominantly. They built about 2,900 of the plane there, versus Supermarine had built about 700 of the Mark V's. Now they had adequate performance to counter the 109F. Now they also introduced at the time a Spitfire Mark 6. It was basically the same platform, but it had extended wingtips, pressurized cockpit for high altitude interception, and it also featured a four-bladed propeller and a slightly reduced horsepower, because they could do that because they also took away a lot of weight. They reduced the weight in this plane. Now the biggest problem with this plane was that when the pilot got in, they bolted shut the canopy, so he had no way of getting out. So obviously this wasn't a success, and it wasn't very popular with the pilots. Going all the way up there in a coffin that's bolted shut. The Spitfire Mark 7 and the Mark 8 were then supposed to be the replacements for the Mark 5 and the Mark 6. With the Mark 7 then being a pressurized plane with a sliding canopy, and the Mark 8 being unpressurized. And then the Germans introduced the Focke-Wulf 190A in mid-1942, and suddenly the Spitfire Mark 5 found itself completely outperformed. And now it's interesting at this stage to note that the Mark 5 and the Mark 9 were both interim planes, and they were most produced of all the planes of the Spitfire range. So the Mark 8 required a redesign of the airframe. It could not be built fast enough and in sufficient numbers. So they took a modified Mark 5 airframe, lengthened it a bit, fitted the Merlin 61 or 63 at 1,500 and 1,990 horsepower. And part of that changes include the lengthening of about 18 centimeters in front of the engine bulkhead to take the intercooler and a new 2-speed, 2-stage supercharger to give high altitude performance. Just want to take note that there was a Mark 16 which was not powered by a Griffin. The guys that know the Spitfires will understand this point now, but it was actually Mark 9 with a Packard built Merlin engine called the V1650, developing between 1290 and 1390 horsepower. So from 1942, when the Mark 9 became available in numbers, it stayed the mainstay of Spitfire squadrons. Even till the war's end, even after introduction of the Griffin engine Mark 14 model, and ultimately 5,656 Mark 9s were eventually built. There were some last big developments during the war years. There was a Mark 14 with a Griffin engine, developing over 2,000 horsepower, which was quite a performer. It's got the model over there, which we'll see in landing day, in D-Day landing color scheme. And there were two further fighter marks. There was a Mark 18 and a Mark 21, were built right at the end or just after the war, but at this time the jet engine had taken over, and there was no demand for piston engine fighters really. So the total of over 20,000 Spitfires that were built, that was the last of them. Now just a quick look at the performance of the main marks. The Mark 1 came with the Merlin 2 or the 3. The Mark 5 had the Merlin 40 series engines. The Mark 9, the Merlin 60 series, and then the Mark 14 with the Griffin engine. Now we can look at how the performance changed. First, I think cruising speed, we started with that Mark 5 at 272 miles per hour, going up to 362 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The interesting one is the climb rate right at the bottom. Mark 1 would climb 2,500 feet per minute, going up to the Mark 9 at 4,000 feet, and then the Griffin engine at 4,500 feet a minute, which is quite a substantial improvement. The aircraft also weighed a lot more, and there was always complaints that the added power with the added weight didn't really, you just got some improvement, but it wasn't such a huge improvement every time. It was a very docile plane to fly. You can clearly see how the pressure over the wing. Now this picture isn't quite accurate. The rounded shape wing, which is, maybe just leave this for this guy to get past. There we go. So the picture on the left, that's basically the Spitfire wing, almost, not quite. But you can see how the pressure changes the stall characteristics. The wing would stall from the root going out, where you look at the swept wing at the bottom, where the stall would start on the ailerons. So that's an aircraft that you can stall a wing and you will have aileron control. You'll feel it starting and you'll be able to correct and to work through it. When you get down to a plane with a swept wing here, where the stall starts on the aileron, that's like same as what the Mustang had. That's the kind of plane you would not do a roll at low altitude, because you would not recover from it. Wing designs on the Spitfire. The A-wing at the top of 4 machine guns per side. The B-wing at the bottom, where they had the 2 machine guns plus the cannon. And then the D-wing, which had provision for 2 machine guns but also 2 cannons right next to each other in the wing where the hub is for the ammunition. Sorry. That is how the machine guns and the cannon would fit with the ammunition in between them. Just a quick look at the profile of these different planes. That is Wing Commander Sailor Malang, South African, that flew for the Royal Air Force. It's plane at the top there, Douglas Bader's Mark I at the bottom. Well known and very loved shape of Spitfire. The Mark V, in this case in a desert scheme, with one of Cecil Vaux's filters, which added a lot of drag. But that was one of the problems, and we'll get to that later, in getting these planes operational in North Africa, was sand and dust ingestion. That was a solution, but it came at a cost of a lot of drag added. The 2 Mark IX's profiles with a standard canopy, and then what they call the low back with a bubble canopy. That is happened to be a South African one on the right hand side, which we'll also get to towards the end of the presentation. And then the Mark XIV with a much bigger Griffin engine, and you can see this is now a completely different looking animal. It's still a Spitfire, it's still easily recognizable, but it does look quite a bit different from the Mark I. There's just a quick breakdown of how from the Mark I top there, how the plane became longer as you got to the Mark 8 and 9 here. Got even longer when you got to the Mark 21, Mark 18 there. And that had to do mostly with rudders that became larger and engines that became longer, and especially the introduction of the superchargers that had to move the engine forward. Now, this is a little bit of a short story of what it is like flying the aircraft. Now we'll also listen to a Spitfire pilot right now after this telling us what it's like to fly a Spitfire. But this, I got this from the internet. It's this guy just describing what it is, what it encompasses and what it was like. He said, you sit inside and the blades, the propeller blades look huge. Then you also watch for overprime. So you overprimed, you get these flames from the exhaust, and then you had to keep on, by the starter, you had to keep the starter going to get those flames blown away. And then this is this Merlin, which is a 27-liter engine, V12. He says it'll suddenly go to idle, and it'll sound like a 1960s racing car, V12. And you can hear the propeller reduction gearbox clicking in the front. So a Spitfire has no steerable tail wheel, and you have to turn using full rudder and differential braking on the two wheels. The brakes, the flaps, the radiator shutters are powered by compressed air. It's a small compressor driven by the camshaft at the rear of a cylinder bank. And we were talking yesterday, Brendan, about the lever which you have to disengage until it builds pressure before you can lift the undercarriage. And if you didn't lift it fully, it could sit in front of the radiator, and you could get all kinds of problems. So you do a gentle power check. The one thing with a Spitfire, if you open that throttle on the ground, you will flip it onto its nose. So you check the mag switches left and right. Quick sync of the propeller pitch, just fully fine. You allow the revs not to fall below 1800, and then you go. It's quite simple. There are a lot of systems to check. You set the radiators to fully open, the rudder nose fully right to counter the propeller torque. Opening the throttle and the aircraft accelerates very quickly. It says even at 4 to 6 pounds per square inch of boost, just over half throttle, the plane will accelerate to 100 miles per hour very quickly. You start getting directional control and pitch control as soon as the slipstream hits the rudder, and you set the radiators to fully open, canopy closed, and then you'll start feeling the pressure on your right hand as that trim setting kicks in, and you have to correct that, otherwise it will lift you clean out of the seat. Now Pete Brothers, who was a wartime Spit pilot, he said that the Spitfires seem to read your mind and turn and do things without you seeming to actually do it with a stick. So after the flying, the Spitfire pilots realized that he was dead right. You just think of turning and the plane will turn. Now there's a reason for this, why it handled so beautifully. It had no vices, it was a good clean design, pleasant, easy to fly, and this is the controls light and powerful because of design, but also because it had what they call a broken stick. So you didn't move like in a Messerschmitt. The whole stick didn't move. The bottom half stood. You only moved the top half of the stick. So you could fly. You can throw it around in combat, and you wouldn't get tired the way that most other aircraft would tire you. A very gentle stall characteristics, as we said, no wing drop tendencies. You get a nice buzz on the stick as you approach the stall, you get plenty of warning, and you can accurately hold it on the turn on the buffet. At low power settings, the engine is remarkably quiet, I said, but then when you open the throttle into positive boost, it's a wonderful growl that comes from the rudder through the engine, through the cockpit. It's quite a sight, a long nose, and then your downward view is poor. You've obviously got these huge wings next to you. When you come in for landing, you get to below 160 miles per hour. That's the time you can lower the undercarriage. Push on the mixture lever, set to auto reach, fuel booster pump on, prop pitch set fully fine. Radiator set to open the canopy, and then as your final turn, the undercarriage gear indicator is rechecked, and you close the throttle slowly to listen if it is, to see if that warning hooter is silent. And when you open that canopy and you close that throttle, you suddenly get that backfire exhaust, sounds like a 12-gauge shotgun going off in front of you. And then with the split flaps going down, the Spitfire pitches noticeably nose down, improving your view and makes your speed control much easier when you come into land. So you come in over the fence, you cross a threshold at about 100 miles per hour. The aircraft is easily landed, slight hold off and touch down on main wheels. Tail wheel about a foot off the ground. The view is then still adequate over the nose. And you still have good directional stability because the rudder is still in the slipstream. And then the tricky part about landing, after lowering the tail to the ground, you have to be positive and quick with the rudder inputs. because it doesn't have a steerable tail wheel and no slipstream over the rudder with your throttle closed, and you have to be positive on your rudder to keep it straight. It's got a narrow track undercarriage, and any swing you have to stop it quickly, otherwise you're going to get a ground loop. And then you throttle back, dead cut, the mag check is done, mixture control is moved to the idle and cutoff, and the engine shuts down with a final pop and a crackle. And then you can finally relax and feel very relieved to have brought it back without bending it and becoming the most hated pilot in the land. Now, there's an interview I recorded with James, if you insist. If you insist, I can't pronounce that. He was a SAAF. He was at on the SAAF pilot course in '81 with John and Charles over there. He flew mostly helicopters. It's those funny things with the cooling fans at the top. And he was invited by Colonel Thomas to join the SAAF museum flight and to display the Spitfire. And that was AXK, which we will also look at later on in the presentation. So he flew this as a display aircraft. So let's see if I can get this going. Here's a Spitfire Mark V from number 1 Squadron in Tunisia in the color scheme. That's the stone and dark earth color scheme. That is in Italy in October of '43. It's also 1 Squadron Mark V with a grey-green color scheme. That's 40 Squadron with that oblique camera where the roundel is. That was in Greece in 1944. The Spitfire Mark IX was flown by 41 Squadron in the high altitude interceptor. They just flew them in plain aluminium color. That is a 4 Squadron Mark V in the blue top, dark blue and light grey bottom. There's another Spitfire in 4 Squadron colors. That's a Mark IX in '43. That was a 9 Squadron in Al Gamil in Egypt in June 1944. 2 Squadron converting to and that what we see in the picture is the 500-pound bomb centerline mounted instead of 250-pound bombs under the wings in the ground attack role that they later used, and that's rolled out to other squadrons as well. It wasn't something that happened. The Spitfires arrived with a hard fitting for 250 pounds, so that was an infield job that they did. There's a 7 Squadron Mark V with a long-range tank, the 90-gallon centerline tank, used mostly for ferry flights. Just for reference, the squadron codes, and if you look at some of the models there, you'll see the AX 1 Squadron, DB 2 Squadron, CA was 3 Squadron, 4 Squadron KJ, and then the models that they flew, it was only 1 Squadron that flew the Mark 8 as well. The others all flew Mark 5s and Mark 9s. There's some pictures of what the old Spitfires looked like. That was all in Italy, Mark 9s. That's a Mark 5 2 Squadron on their way to bomb some unfortunate Italian position. There's a 40 Squadron, and there's one of the big changes that they managed to do in East Africa, also in the theater modification. The guys at Abukir came up with that filter, that air filter that's at the bottom there, a lot less drag than that huge Vaux filter, and this is what was called the Abukir filter, or Abukir filter. A very good plan to make suddenly in the field. And some nice pictures of a 40 Squadron pilot and ground crew. There's a good picture of the 2 cannons mounted side by side on a Mark V wing. They must have taken a tank out easily with that. That's one of the 7 squadron planes, and this is operational training unit aircraft in the north. Spitfire Mark 5. You can see that huge filters at the bottom. Okay, now as part of the Commonwealth gift, the SAAF were allocated 136 Spitfire Mark 9s, 50 Mark 9Es with Merlin 63 engines, and 86 HF Mark 9Es with Merlin 70 engines. So 53 squadrons were flown to the Union on different dates in 1947, accompanied by 4 Venturas from 60 Squadron on the different occasions when they were flying, and also 2 Dakotas, 6841 and 6856. The rest were all shipped in 1948, sometimes 7 and sometimes only 1 per ship. On arrival, the Spitfires sent to Snake Valley for servicing and conversion to operational status. By early 41, both 1 and 2 squadrons were up to strength, with both squadrons donating 2 aircraft each to 35 Squadron in Durban for maritime duties they shared with the Harvards, the Oxfords and the Venturas. And it is believed that they were assigned to bring the numbers of 35 Squadron up to prevent closing the base at Stamford Hill. They had a big accident there, and the planes were reassigned back to their squadrons. And that's brought an end to their 35 Squadron sea patrol duties. Okay, during the late 1940s, the Spitfires were regulars at air shows, or that they were called air pageants then, even as far as Bulawayo and Lorenzo Marks. And in August 48, some Spits were moved to Langebaan as an introduction to bombing, gunnery and navigation school, growing to 64 Spitfires over the next 6 years. Then in 1950, South African Air Force offered the UN Spitfire Squadron to fight in Korea, but they said, no thank you, we would like the squadron, but to fly Mustangs in favor, and that's just for uniformity with the United States Air Force in Korea. And number 2 Squadron trained on the Spitfires in South Africa and then converted to Mustangs in Korea. The focus then became supporting 2 Squadron between 50 and 52. And most Spitfires were rotated to Air Operations School. There were ever 34 Spitfires involved in accidents during 1950 alone, and this reached the papers. So, and then a further 3 accidents in 4 days in January 51, and the press started asking questions. You know, the planes are getting old. Is it still worth it keeping them in the air? And this matter was even discussed in Parliament after a public outcry. Some pictures of some crashed Spitfires. They were just at that era. They were just too old. They were just not keeping them flying, keeping them up to date anymore. So by January of 53, the days of piston engine frontline fighters were over. 1 squadron had begun taking on Vampires in October 52, and were flying both aircraft at the same time for a period, while Spitfires were withdrawn systematically. But old legends die hard, and there's the story that follows that became folklore at the time. It was James Sweeney, or Horse Sweeney, happened to tell Tank Odendaal of his preference for the Spitfire over the Vampire, which did not go well with Tank, and that challenge was issued and accepted. So each of the 2 pilots would choose an aircraft, and the first to reach 30,000 feet would be declared the winner. But Horst knew that the Vampire took 11 minutes 15 seconds to reach that height, and he was pretty sure he could beat that. So on the 27th of June 53, the Vampire and the Spitfire lined up at Langebaan and thundered into the sky. And this is now Horst's words. He said, I flew at 18 pounds boost for 5 minutes, then down to 12 pounds boost, and I reached 25,000 feet in 6 minutes 8 seconds. Reaching 30,000 feet in 8 minutes 12 seconds, and the Vampire arrived in 11 minutes 15 seconds as advertised. Tank didn't say much after landing, apparently. Now, how do we close this chapter? There was a number of bodies and parts around, and it was incredible that it wasn't even considered to preserve more of these planes. The Secretary of Defense in 1954 put up 58 Spitfires, all serviceable or repairable,
as well as an extra 16 Merlin 63s and 11 Merlin 70 engines for sale awaiting tenders, and they were all sold foot stewards and mostly as scrap. Some of these planes ended up as gate guards or scrapyard guards, as the one in Maitland did. Some went overseas, but a small number did survive. The SAXONWORLD world of military history, there is an aircraft was delivered to the RAF as JF294 in January of 43. The Union then asked for an aircraft for displaying and flying around the country. It was then flown from Cairo to Cape Town for exhibitions in March of 44 and delivered to the SAAF as 5501. And it's been displayed at that museum in SAXONWORLD from 1948 until now. It's a Mark 8. It's extended wingtips, a BEM metal finish. It's not silver painted. And the rivets is standing out in a slightly darker color. Fabric control surfaces on the elevator and rudder painted silver. Displays a number 5501 on the side. But this is a South African serial number. Original number was JF294. Sorry. And there's a picture of it being flown in South Africa with the extended tank at the bottom. You can see the engine, one of those Rolls-Royce engines, and that's the plane in the museum. Then for our age group, I think EVELYN is probably the most well-known Spitfire, ordered from Castle Bromwich in February 42, was powered by Merlin 63, delivered to 6th Maintenance Unit at Bryce Norton in 43, forwarded to Maintenance Unit, and then shipped to Casablanca for the torch landings. It was allocated to the SAAF, was returned to the RAF in May 44. It's stored until selected for sale to the SAF, and it went on the SS Campbell on the 30th of September 48. Got 5601 number and went into storage at 15 Air Depot. Was sold in 1954 to a hospital for handicapped children near Hartbeesfontein, where it remained until bought by Larry Barnett and Alan Lurie for 20 Rand in 1967. There was an extension restoration over an 8-year period with help from Atlas Aviation, and the engine burst into life in September 75 for the first flight on the 29th of September. It became the star of many air shows until a slight mishap in 84 with some damage to the propeller and cowling. It was easily repaired and flying again by 86. And then a rumor started of the aircraft being sold. And in effect, in 86 it was shipped to Santa Monica and repainted in the famous Johnny Johnson color scheme of JEJ. By late 99, it was purchased by Rolls-Royce and donated to Flying Museum in Brazil. And that is EVELYN. There's also a model of it over there. Then our last one, AXK, was the 5,556 Mark 9 built at Castle Bromwich in May of 1945 after the war. Powered by a Merlin 70, immediately put into storage and then selected for sale to the SAF. Was flown from Egypt to South Africa and taken on charge in 48. While involved in collision with another Spitfire, was repaired, sent back to Squadron, crashed again into a drogue cable and repaired again, sent back to one Squadron, and eventually was put on static display at Waterkloof for the next 23 years. Then the value was recognized and she was shipped to storage at Lanseria and ultimately sold to David Price in the mid-80s. Got a donation of 100,000 Rand from a technology company that kick-started the rebuild. And the Merlin 63 was sent to Vintage V12 in the US for a rebuild. That was the problem, is that engine they never got it fully fixed. Came back in 93, it was moved to Atlas Aviation for the final work. And it flew in time for the 75th anniversary of the SAF. It was painted as AXK from one Squadron. It flew from 95 with at least 2 groundings and an full engine rebuild until it crashed in 2000 at Swartkops. And it was found that the engine and some parts can be useful for a rebuild. That is AXK. And there it's still flying. But ultimately, the bulk of the Spitfires built ended up as in the last picture of the presentation. And with this, I say thank you. It's turned out to be a bit longer. I was afraid I was having too little or too few slides for a proper presentation. But I think we've gone from the build, and ultimately we end with what happened to all the Spitfires. Thank you.